The day I realized my neighbors had accidentally committed a federal crime started with a fishing rod, a bucket of catfish, and a concrete parking lot that absolutely did not belong where it was. 9 days later, the president of our homeowners association was being led away in handcuffs. The developer who thought he owned half the county was staring down prison time, and an entire luxury subdivision was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Now, if that sounds exaggerated, believe me, I wish it was. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 48 years old, retired from railroad infrastructure maintenance, and until all this happened, I live in a little weathered bungalow outside Raleigh, North Carolina, the same house my grandfather bought after returning from Korea in the early 1950s. It wasn't much to look at. 800 square feet, creaky floors, a metal roof that sang every time it rained, and a front porch swing that probably should have been replaced 20 years ago. But it was home. My grandfather raised my father there. My father raised me there. Every scratch in those walls had a story attached to it. The funny thing was that for decades, nobody paid much attention to my property. Then developers discovered the land around it. Suddenly, everybody became interested in what old Ethan Mercer was doing with his little patch of dirt. Around 2021, construction began on a massive subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. They cleared forests, flattened hills, and built hundreds of oversized houses that all somehow looked exactly the same. Within 3 years, the place was packed with luxury homes, swimming pools, designer landscaping, golf carts buzzing around like mosquitoes, and enough outdoor lighting to be visible from space. Right in the middle of all that sat my grandfather's old bungalow, like a stubborn weed nobody could kill. I could tell some of the residents hated looking at it. They never said it directly, at least not at first, but I caught the looks. I'd be sitting on my porch drinking coffee while couples drove by slowly, staring at the house with the same expression people use when they discover a dent in a new car. A few of them approached me over the years. One offered to buy my property. Another suggested I'd be happier in a retirement community. One woman actually told me my house hurt property values. I just smiled and kept rocking on the porch swing. Behind my property ran an old railroad spur. Most people thought it was abandoned. Rust covered the rails. Weeds grew between the ties. Trees leaned over parts of it. Kids occasionally wandered down there looking for snakes. To everyone else, it looked like junk. To me, it was part of the landscape I'd known my entire life. Growing up, my grandfather used to tell stories about freight cars rolling through there carrying lumber and tobacco. By the time I was born, traffic had long since stopped. Still, he never referred to it as abandoned. He'd always say, just because something isn't being used doesn't mean it's dead. At the time, I thought he was talking about the railroad. Years later, I realized he was talking about people too. The HOA president was a woman named Denise Caldwell. If confidence could be bottled and sold, she'd have been a billionaire. Denise loved authority. She loved meetings, regulations, committees, and hearing herself talk. Every month, there seemed to be another newsletter explaining what residents could plant, park, paint, build, or think. Since my property wasn't part of the HOA, she technically had no authority over me, which seemed to bother her more than she ever admitted. Then there was the developer, a man named Russell Kane. Russell had one of those permanent smiles that never reach his eyes. Every conversation with him felt like sitting across from a salesman who already assumed you'd sign the contract. The first time we met, he offered me what sounded like a generous amount of money for my land. I declined. The second time, he increased the offer. I declined again. The third time, he said, "Eventually everybody sells, Ethan." I remember laughing and telling him, my grandfather's been dead 20 years and he still hasn't sold. He didn't appreciate the joke. Looking back, I think that's when the resentment really started. The subdivision kept expanding. New roads appeared. More houses went up. Then one afternoon, I overheard two construction supervisors talking at a gas station. They mentioned plans to expand parking near a recreational complex they were building. One of them pointed roughly toward my property. At the time, I didn't think much about it. A few weeks later, I left before sunrise to spend the day fishing at Falls Lake. It was peaceful. No phone calls. No HOA newsletters. No developers. Just water and silence. By late afternoon, I was heading home with enough fish for dinner and absolutely no idea my life was about to change. As I turned onto my road, something felt wrong immediately. There were construction vehicles parked near my property. Fresh tire tracks cut through the grass. Then I saw it. The railroad spur behind my land had disappeared. In its place stretched a massive slab of fresh concrete, smooth, gray, and still radiating heat from the summer sun. I parked my truck and just stared at it. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed a laminated sign attached to my fence. Parking expansion project. Authorized access only. I walked the length of the slab. Every step made my stomach tighten. They hadn't just paved near the railroad spur. They had buried it completely. Worse, a significant section of that concrete crossed directly onto my property line. I stood there listening to distant lawn sprinklers running in the subdivision while staring at 60 tons of concrete sitting where it absolutely had no right to be. And for the first time in years, I heard my grandfather's voice echoing in my memory. Just because something isn't being used doesn't mean it's dead. That night, I climbed into the attic and pulled down a dusty metal file cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. I had no idea yet that inside those old folders was the document that would destroy an HOA, bankrupt a developer, and change the course of several lives forever. That old file cabinet smelled like dust, machine oil, and history. The kind of smell you only find in places where nobody has touched anything for years. I carried it downstairs, set it on my kitchen table, and started opening drawers that hadn't been opened since my father passed away. Most of the folders were exactly what you'd expect from a railroad family. Tax records, property surveys, maintenance notes, old photographs of locomotives, handwritten letters from people who had been gone longer than I'd been alive. Around midnight, I found the folder that changed everything. It was labeled simply Spur Line Easement. Inside was a survey map dated 1951, several transfer documents, and correspondence between the original railroad company and local government agencies. The more I read, the more my pulse started climbing. See, most people assume that if railroad tracks aren't being used, they're automatically abandoned. That's not how it works. Rail corridors exist under an entirely different legal framework than ordinary private property. Formal abandonment requires procedures, filings, approvals, and documentation. Missing even one step can leave an easement legally active for decades. Around 1 a.m, I finally found what I was looking for. There was no abandonment approval, no termination order, no kloucherfeiting, nothing. The rail easement still legally existed. I sat back in my chair, staring at the paperwork. Outside, crickets chirped through the open kitchen window. Inside, everything suddenly felt very quiet. Then another memory surfaced. About 6 months earlier, I'd heard rumors about a logistics company planning a distribution center east of town. At the time, I didn't care. Warehouses weren't exactly exciting conversation. But now I remembered hearing something else. They had been exploring rail access. My rail access. I started making phone calls the next morning. By noon, I had confirmation. A transportation company called Carolina Freight Systems had spent months negotiating with county officials regarding potential reactivation of the exact spur line that now sat under a mountain of concrete. The man I spoke with nearly choked when I explained what had happened. "You're telling me they paved over the corridor?" he asked. "Not near it," I said. "On top of it." There was a long silence. Then he asked me to email photographs immediately. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. This time it was their CEO, a guy named Victor Lang. Victor sounded like a man who had just discovered somebody parked a bulldozer in his living room. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "please tell me these photos are inaccurate." "I wish they were," I replied. He exhaled slowly. "Do you have copies of the easement documents?" "Already scanned." "Send everything." By that evening, attorneys were involved. Not local attorneys either. Transportation attorneys. Federal regulatory attorneys. People whose hourly billing rates probably exceeded my mortgage payment back when I still had one. Things moved fast after that. Faster than anything I'd ever seen. On the second day, emergency filings were submitted. Regulatory agencies were notified. Federal transportation officials were contacted. County permitting departments suddenly found themselves receiving phone calls from lawyers asking uncomfortable questions. Then came the first domino. A temporary injunction froze several permits associated with ongoing construction inside Willow Creek Estates. It wasn't a complete shutdown yet, but it was enough to create panic. The subdivision sales office started fielding calls from nervous buyers. Contractors were left waiting for approvals. Planned closings got delayed. Money stopped moving. And when money stops moving, powerful people get nervous. The first call came from Russell Kane. I was sitting on my porch cleaning fish when my phone rang. "Ethan," he said, trying very hard to sound friendly. "There seems to be some confusion." "Funny," I said. The concrete looked pretty clear to me. His voice tightened. "Nobody intended to create a problem. You poured 60 tons of concrete over a railroad easement. An abandoned railroad easement. According to who?" Silence. Then he shifted tactics. "Look, let's be practical. We can work something out." I laughed. Not because I was trying to be rude. It was just genuinely funny hearing the same man who spent years trying to pressure me suddenly talking about compromise. "Russell," I said, "I think we're way past practical." Then I hung up. 2 hours later, Denise Caldwell showed up at my front porch. She stepped out of a luxury SUV wearing sunglasses worth more than my first truck. "You've made your point," she said. "Have I? This can all be resolved." Interesting. Nobody wanted to resolve anything before the concrete trucks arrived. She crossed her arms. The community invested a lot into improving this area. By stealing part of it, her jaw tightened. For the first time I saw something crack beneath her confidence. Not fear exactly, more like uncertainty. The realization that events were no longer following her script. She left angry. 3 days later, things got worse for them. Much worse. Summer temperatures pushed into the upper 90s. Engineers discovered sections of the new concrete were already developing structural problems because of poor preparation beneath the surface. Remember, they had poured over existing rail infrastructure rather than removing it properly. Expansion stress created fractures. Small at first, then larger. Repair estimates started climbing. Tens of thousands of dollars evaporated almost overnight. Around the same time, federal investigators arrived. Real investigators. Not county inspectors. Not HOA consultants. Federal personnel carrying badges and asking detailed questions. They interviewed contractors, surveyors, board members, permit officials. Everyone. Rumors spread through the subdivision like wildfire. Homeowners gathered in driveways discussing lawsuits. People started demanding answers from the HOA board. Social media groups exploded with speculation. Denise attempted damage control. She issued statements claiming misunderstandings and administrative errors. Nobody was buying it anymore. One evening, a neighbor from the subdivision knocked on my door. I'd spoken with him a few times before. Nice guy. Retired Air Force. He looked exhausted. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked. "What's that?" A lot of us never even knew this project was happening. That stuck with me. Because people often assume HOA disasters affect only the board members responsible. They don't. Ordinary homeowners usually end up paying the bill. Families who had absolutely nothing to do with the decision suddenly found themselves trapped inside a growing legal nightmare. By the end of the week, investigators had assembled a timeline. Emails surfaced. Internal communications surfaced. Approval chains surfaced. And those documents painted a very ugly picture. The evidence suggested that warnings had been ignored. Property boundary concerns had been dismissed. Questions regarding the rail corridor had been brushed aside because certain people believed nobody would challenge them. That assumption turned out to be the most expensive mistake of their lives. Then day 7 arrived. I'll never forget it. I was drinking coffee on my porch when my phone started vibrating nonstop. Calls, texts, emails, one after another. Finally, Victor Lang called. His voice sounded almost stunned. "They did it," he said. "Did what?" "Federal prosecutors filed charges." I sat there holding the phone while the morning breeze moved through the oak trees. "Against who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Denise Caldwell, Russell Kane, and several others are still under review." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Not because I felt sorry for them. Not because I felt victorious. Honestly, I was just amazed. Less than a week earlier, those people had believed they controlled everything. The neighborhood, the permits, the development, the future. Now federal prosecutors were alleging that their decisions had interfered with protected transportation infrastructure and caused substantial damages. And while the criminal case was making headlines, another storm was forming right behind it. Victor's attorneys had finished calculating losses associated with the blocked rail corridor. The number they produced was large enough to make even wealthy developers sweat. That's when I realized the criminal investigation was only half the disaster. The civil consequences were about to be even worse. And on the morning of day 8, my phone rang with a call that proved just how desperate they had become. The call came a little after 8 in the morning. I recognized the number immediately because it belonged to one of the law firms representing Willow Creek Estates. A week earlier, nobody from that office would have returned my calls. Now, they were calling before breakfast. I answered and heard a tired voice on the other end. Not aggressive, not confident, just tired. "Mr. Mercer, we're hoping to discuss a settlement." I leaned back in my porch swing and watched a squirrel run across the yard. Funny how everyone's interested in discussions now. The attorney let out a slow breath. "What would it take to resolve your claims?" For a few seconds, I said nothing. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I had spent the previous night thinking carefully about that exact question. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about accountability. Too many people had spent years acting like ownership rights only mattered when wealthy people were involved. The moment they looked at my old bungalow, my rusted mailbox, and my overgrown railroad spur, they decided my rights were negotiable. So I gave them my answer. Full compensation for the property damage. Permanent easement payments moving forward. Complete removal of every ounce of concrete. Professional restoration of the rail corridor under certified engineering supervision. Independent surveys. Written guarantees. No shortcuts. No favors. No exceptions. The attorney was quiet for several moments. Then he said, "That's going to be expensive." I laughed. "You should have thought about that before you buried a railroad." By that evening, negotiations accelerated. The criminal investigation was expanding. Civil damages were increasing. Insurance companies were getting involved. Lenders were asking questions. Investors were getting nervous. Every hour that passed made the situation worse for them. On day 9, they accepted the deal. Just like that, money arrived by wire transfer. Documents were signed. Restoration orders were issued. Then came the most satisfying sound I've ever heard in my life. Jackhammers. For nearly 2 weeks, construction crews worked from sunrise until well after dark, breaking apart the same concrete they had been so proud of pouring. The sound echoed across Willow Creek Estates every single day. Homeowners complained. HOA meetings turned chaotic. People demanded resignations. Some families were suddenly facing emergency assessments worth thousands of dollars because insurance covered only part of the damage. Every decision made by Denise and Russell was now coming back like a boomerang. One evening, I stood near the work site watching crews remove broken concrete chunks. A homeowner walked up beside me. "You know," he said, "a lot of people are angry." I nodded. I figured. He surprised me by smiling. "Most of them aren't angry at you." A few weeks later, another chapter closed. Carolina Freight Systems finalized a purchase agreement for the rail rights and associated easement interests. The amount was more money than I'd ever imagined seeing attached to that forgotten strip of land behind my grandfather's house. The same railroad spur everyone had mocked for years suddenly became one of the most valuable assets in the county. Funny how perspective works. 3 months after the settlement, I packed my belongings, loaded my truck, and left North Carolina. I bought a quiet lake house in eastern Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just peace, water, trees, a duck. Most mornings I sit outside with coffee and watch the sunrise crawl across the lake. Sometimes I fish. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I do absolutely nothing at all, which turns out to be one of life's greatest luxuries. Meanwhile, the fallout back in Willow Creek Estates continued. Denise Caldwell eventually accepted a plea agreement that included prison time and community service obligations. Russell Kane received an even harsher outcome after additional financial misconduct surfaced during the broader investigation. His development company never recovered. Within a year, it entered bankruptcy proceedings. Several board members resigned. Multiple lawsuits followed. The subdivision survived, but its reputation never fully did. Every now and then someone sent me updates. Photos, news articles, rumors. Most of the time, I barely pay attention anymore. That chapter of my life is over. But every so often I'll think about my grandfather sitting on that old porch decades ago, talking about railroads and life and things people underestimate. He was right. Just because something isn't being used doesn't mean it's dead. Sometimes an old railroad track is still worth millions. Sometimes an old property file contains enough paperwork to bring down powerful people. And sometimes the guy everyone dismisses as irrelevant turns out to be the one person they should have paid attention to. The truth is, Denise and Russell didn't lose everything because of concrete. They lost everything because they convinced themselves that power gave them permission to ignore boundaries. They believed wealth could replace due diligence. They assumed nobody would challenge them. In the end, that assumption destroyed them far more effectively than any lawsuit ever could. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the settlement, or would you have pushed all the way through trial and let the courts decide every last dollar? And on the other side of that question, do you think homeowners who had nothing to do with the decision should have been forced to pay the price for mistakes made by HOA leadership? Let me know what you think in the comments, because people are still arguing about that one to this day. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with a difficult HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where common sense somehow left the building. Trust me, sometimes the smallest piece of forgotten history can completely change who wins in the end.